globalization on local architecture, especially in Middle East. Architecture today confers two opposite forces: globalization that represents the now and the effort of the local architecture that wants to preserve the past and its identities. So now my question is how architects can face these two things correctly, and how architects can interact both locally and globally at the same time. Globalization and westernization of the world. So architects in some country like my country prefer to follow the same patterns and material as a style as Western countries instead of working and developing their local architecture. Local architecture in many situations has a perfect response to living condition and natural environment and has suggested the appropriate techniques and materials to control the climate and weather condition. For example, globalization has affected not only the shape of the building but also the concept of architecture. Because of that, we can see many buildings do not have any consistency to local architecture and culture. According to Robert Adams' article, when the architects design and change a place, not only does this change the way we see ourselves, but it affects on the identity of the place. Other countries in the Middle East have the same problem, but slightly different, since they do not have local architecture like Iran, and also for some political and economic situation, they are much more eager to practice the simplistic version of modernism. Thus, the Western architecture appears more distinct in these countries, such as Dubai and Qatar. Also, this style of architecture is not appropriate with culture and the weather condition. For example, when you walk in Dubai street, you do not feel you walk in Arab country. Ironically, the wrong assumption exists among most people in this country that adopting Western architecture without any consideration of local architecture is not necessary. They assume this building limitation shows their development. According
Yeah, go on. Okay, so on a less serious note, mine's portrays it's called fun theory, which is changing the human environment and making basically anything you do more fun and enjoyable. And I know you've heard about it, and it kind of came up in another presentation where I talked about so I think it's through Volkswagen, and they're trying to make everything more enjoyable by switching, not inventing new things, but just reusing the things we have and making them more adaptable to, I guess, to make them, just more fun. There's a couple videos, but I'll show this one. This little boy that had problems like lifting the seat when he went to the bathroom. So what his dad did is like put a little like cowboy with guns on it, and if he lifted the seat, like the guns weren't there, but if he didn't, the guns stayed there, so they were covered up by the seat. And like after like 2 months or so, the kid learned how to like lift up the seat. So I think it's fun and enjoyable just how little things like that through design or architecture maybe can make everything around us a bit more enjoyable.
For me, my focus was on sort of the branding and marketing of the profession, and specifically sort of how the prestige of an architect isn't really the same as it used to be, where now there's sort of a negative perception towards what we do and the services that we provide, especially as other forces in the building and construction industry are getting their hands on certain technologies and things that kind of give the perception that what we do just really doesn't have a lot of value anymore. So we know what we provide, so it's kind of thinking about it in a way of how we can start to brand ourselves in a new way, in a creative way that starts to reach to people in a little different manner, ways to effectively communicate and reach to people in ways that they can relate to us better and start to gain a sense of trust in what we do. Again, and I wanted to look at it through kind of the social media and especially particularly the website as a tool to do that. And the article, there's a couple examples, and El Dorado, I mean, I'm in that studio right now, and I think that's a pretty good example of that. Pretty much we've been drilled around that concept for the most part throughout this whole year in the studio. But with their website, they kind of do that, and it kind of comes across as kind of cheesy and goofy, I guess. But some of these things, they post writings, these essays that they come up with that are around a certain idea that tie into projects. And as a person looking at a website, I think that kind of thing has the potential to engage people more in a more dynamic way, where they feel like they can understand where your ideas are being generated from, rather than just going through your portfolio and seeing the final building. And that may work for some of the the Starchitects that are already out there, where their name's kind of already established. But this kind of thing, maybe a way to start relating to people, I guess, in a more direct way, where maybe it captures their attention in a different way that it's just different than looking at an animal shelter they might have done somewhere else. So kind of reaching to people on a more personable level, I think is an interesting concept to think about in terms of branding. So, and creating a different image for ourselves. And this is
I had a class in my undergrad. It was on comics and aesthetics, and one of our books was copied out the first chapter for you guys, called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. It's a large comic book explaining comic books. I'm not a huge comic book reader, but I'm fascinated by what they can do. The first chapter that I had set was mainly about defining comics and separating them from cartoons. Went through a long description of what is the definition, or kind of a process to arrive at a definition of comics, and it was juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or to produce aesthetic response in the viewer. What I want to think about while you're watching is, can we use the idea and abilities of a more rigorous comic representation to create a better understanding of our design process and design intent? This is not limited to architecture. I'm sure in illustration you've had a lot of dealings with this. Can we use this to better represent our ideas, so you can have multiple images? And then the other part is, a lot of architects think process is king. We love the idea of process and how you arrived at an idea. Can the addition of, comics represent time, which he'll talk about. Can the addition of time into our portfolio documents enhance our representation of our design process?
Mind do in the arts? Well, I started making comics, but I also started trying to understand them almost immediately. One of the most important things about comics that I discovered was that comics are a visual medium, but they try to embrace all the senses within it.
In fact, you can bring in the time and the emotion aspects, or the feeling or sound into a representation of design or thoughts. Just wondering if really pushing the comic idea can bring a larger understanding of this into architecture. We already use it now. I would go out to say that a portfolio document is a comic. You are putting images next to each other in some sort of deliberate order, hopefully in a deliberate order, to represent an overarching